on the dot. I'm going to call the meeting of the Utility Finance Oversight Committee to order. Can I get a roll call?
Chairperson Bennett.
Here.
Vice Chair Bowling.
Here.
Member Scott.
Here.
Member Johnson.
Here.
Member Maples.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you for that. At this time, we'll open for public comment. The public is invited to comment on and discuss any topic that is relevant to or within the authority of the Utility Finance Oversight Committee, including any matter that is not specifically included on the agenda as an action item. No action may be taken on a matter raised under public comment unless the item has been specifically included on the agenda as an item upon which the action may be taken. So with that, I'll look for any public comment.
Chairman Bennett, members of the committee and members of the community, I overlooked last time, I think, an important recognition, and that is the passing of Andy Engelman, a past chairperson of this committee. Andy was a resident of Carson City for many years and was well-known and very active in the community. She was the chairperson of this committee, and I just wanted to say how much I appreciated the opportunity to work with her. Her passing was pretty quiet. She's a very private person, but I think we should recognize that just as an event in the community and a person that we're going to miss. So thank you.
Well, thank you for those words, Bruce, and I agree with your sentiments, and I did have some big shoes to fill. With that, go back to public comment.
Good afternoon. My name is Dana Whaley, and I'm here on behalf of Companion Auto Group, Carson City, Toyota, and Capital Ford, and also for myself personally. Ronnie Hanneman had brought to our attention about the increases that may happen with the sewer and drainage, and we would just like to make a comment on it. I've visited with some of you at your offices and also at our office to discuss, what the final plan may be or how much the increases will be. And we felt that we came away after discussing with you with some ideas that you guys have presented and showed us a hybrid coming back and stuff. And we feel that the increase is necessary. On the first that was brought to our attention by Ronnie Hanneman from the chamber, it was extremely high to the point that I would probably have to lay off an employee to cover that kind of an expense, being put on us. I just, main reason I'm speaking today, after seeing your new hybrid, I just want to say I think that's more in line of what all businesses in Carson City could accept, and I know it's not a final, but it's more in the direction that everybody is paying. And again, I own a lot of rental properties, so away from my business point of it, it's, the last thing that was shown was a fair thing that we discussed. What we talked about with the apartment complexes, the way that you could have 100 or 200 units that would have sewer issues going in from the apartments, and to have a one fee of $29 for that entire unit didn't seem fair to me, and so that I brought that up with you. And I think what we've seen on the last presentation that was given to us, I think that's more in line. So thank you and appreciate your time.
Thank you for your comments today. Any other public comment? Seeing none, we'll close public comment, and we will move on to the approval of the previous meeting minutes. Has everybody had a chance to review, and is there any comments? If not, then I would entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I would move approval of the minutes as presented.
I have a motion by Bruce. Do I have a second? Hold on, I'll jump up at once now. I will second to keep the motion going. Motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye. Mr. Chairman, I will abstain as I was absent.
All right, we have 4 votes aye and then 1 abstention. Moving on to item 2.
If I could make a comment. I was not at the last meeting, although based on the discussion that council has made in the past as far as being able to vote on the minutes, even though we weren't in attendance, I did look at the minutes. I looked at the video of the meeting and feel that the minutes accurately reflect what took place at the meeting, and for that reason, I voted to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Randy. I appreciate your diligence on that. Moving on to item 2, 2A, possible action. Discussion and possible action to recommend to the Board of Supervisors a stormwater rate structure and rate increase that will generate additional revenue up to an additional $1.4 million to support an improved citywide stormwater program. Darren?
Yes, Mr. Chair. We'll just get right over into the meat of it, and our consultant has a presentation to give, so we'll get started with that.
And I'll actually start with some of the background information first. For the record, Andy Hummel, wastewater utility manager, Carson City. Today we're looking at 5 options for the rate study. Last time we brought forth 4. We've added a 5th one. And basically on one end of the spectrum, we have our existing rate structure. There's 5 zoning classes. We bill, and no differentiation, whether it's a small property, big property, on the commercial, things like that. So that's kind of our first bookend on one side. Just take that, raise it a certain percentage to get the funds that we need to generate. And on the far other end of the spectrum, we have looking at if we were to account for every square foot of impervious area on the property and what that would look like. It'd be a lot harder to administer. Doesn't necessarily take into account any drainage improvements that have been done on the site. Carson's code requires, if you're going to be increasing the stormwater runoff, you detain the 5-year storm, make sure the 100-year storm event can pass, things like that, or improve downstream infrastructure to account for that increase. So it's not a, black and white, everybody does the same thing on those properties. And then in the middle, we looked at several options, tweaking, modifying either the existing rate or that impervious to try to get to an easier to administer, more equitable method. So we're gonna look at those. First, I thought I'd start off with some kind of history and background of the program. We did do a public presentation since the last UFOC meeting, so we were gonna review that as well, the comments we received. But as far as the background, we were gonna look at, what this program is, the stormwater program, a little background on our capital improvement plan that we'd like to fund, the current rate structure, the basis of it, what those existing rates look like, our customer base, that kind of stuff, just to fill in some blanks before we jump into Brent's presentation. So as far as our stormwater program itself, we have a number of, adopted and required elements. The first 2 up there, the National Flood Insurance Program and the Community Rating System, both deal with FEMA, basically floodplain management type stuff. Helps reduce rate insurance to our property owners, damages to infrastructure with improvements to the system, helps public safety, and also helps us when we do get into a disaster situation qualify for funding to help clean that up. And then the community rating system is just a further step on that, helps further reduce rate insurance in areas where we would exceed the flood insurance program requirements. And then the municipal separate stormwater system, or MS4, this is a permit issued by NDEP on the West Coast. I don't know if it's timing of when development happened, or, lessons learned from the East Coast, New York, places like that, even like Seattle, have what they call a combined system. When it rains, it all goes in the same pipe with the sewer. Here, it's separate, so we have a completely separate stormwater system from our sewer system. That's why it's a separate storm sewer system. But like I said, that's a permit issued by the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection, and its main goal is reducing discharge of pollutants to our stormwater and improving that stormwater quality. So there's educational requirements, things like that. So as far as the budget and where we spend our money, those various programs, a little hard to see, but the stormwater quality component for 2020 accounts for about 5% of our overall budget. Floodplain management, about 7%. Debt service, that's our bonds, that's about 30% currently of our budget. O&M is about 23%. That's our current 2.3 full-time employee equivalents. And then services, supplies, and equipment that goes with them. And then our capital program is about 22% of that. System improvements, that's currently funded by those bonds that we're paying for. So that's something that this increased program will help. It's mainly targeted towards both the O&M and the capital plan. And then capital reserves is about 12% of the budget. And then our 10-year CIP there, we looked 20 years out. We brought this 10-year forward, kind of tells the big picture of what we need. It's about just under 24 million, but there's some large items out there in that 5 to 10 year window. So our 5-year CIP is about 9.5 million. And they're pretty much spread around the city. So it's not really focused on, one area that we're seeing a problem at. There are kind of problems everywhere. If anybody that was here in the 2017 flood and previous events, it's rain. When it happens, it's everywhere, so. And then as far as the revenue requirement in the additional 1.4 million that was mentioned in the title of the item, we currently do about 1.8 million annually in revenue. Supports a moderate program. We get very limited capital improvement funding out of that, and really not a self-sustaining when we got to do maintenance or a program we're borrowing from other areas, namely the streets fund. We got to pull guys out of there to get stuff done. So this proposed rate plan, approximately 1.4 million additional after if there's a phase in or if it's immediate. But that's what we'd look to generate to support an improved program, be able to support that 10-year CIP as well as the operations. Basically look at adding an additional 3 staff members with that, maintenance staff members, and equipment to go with them. So, and then it would be, with that, a self-sustaining enterprise fund. The rate structure, the background, it's under 12.07 of the Carson City Municipal Code, and the policy is basically that rate structure is applied based on the zoning classification of the property. That's the current rule we have to live by. I won't read that word for word, but that's basically where we're at. And like I mentioned, we got 5 classes there: single-family property, multifamily, public property, manufacturing, and commercial. They're all flat rates regardless of unit count for multifamily or size for manufacturing or commercial. And as far as our customer distribution, we're about 91% single family that pays into this fund. That's a little over 16,000 customers.
Is that distribution, is that by customers or is that by revenue obtained from the customers?
This is by customer count.
Okay.
I do have actual rough revenue numbers. It's a little over $1 million, 1.1 million for single family. Multifamily, about 120,000. Public generates about 40,000. Manufacturing is about 132,000, and commercial 446,000. So. And then I was going to turn it over to Brent here to go through his side of it. Brent Farr with Far West Engineering. But basically, in designing the various rate methodologies that he looked at, it was largely looking at inequities in that existing rate structure and how to deal with those. Like I mentioned, multifamily is a flat rate. Doesn't matter if you're 2 units or 500. Residential office was another one. We've seen some issues where they get billed under commercial, but yet it could be essentially a home business that's zoned for that, but instead of paying a residential rate that they're more equivalent to, they're paying that commercial. And then the size difference in the commercial and the manufacturing, really those two type of uses. And we also see we have various ways that development has occurred where, some sites are one large development, a commercial that's one parcel and numerous tenants on it. And in some cases, it's a multiple parcel situation where they can have, each building is its own and they'd each get their own bill. So try your clicker, I guess, Brent, and see if it works.
Thank you, Andy, and good afternoon. My name is Brent Farr. I'm with Far West Engineering. What we'll be presenting here is sort of a review of what we presented the last time we were here with some minor exceptions and updates. Mostly what was presented to the public on the October 2nd public meeting. So the two main goals of the rate work that we're doing here, number one is to increase the revenues to have a fully functioning stormwater utility, and the second is to address some of the inequities that have existed in the existing structure. And just as a refresher, see, is that thing plugged in? You can just advance it for me, okay. So just going to highlight a couple of properties that indicate some of the challenges that we have. So here's a multifamily property that's just got 3 units on it. It's about a half-acre property and 6,700 square foot of impervious area. So mostly you can see vegetation there, not a lot of pavement. So let's go to the next one as we kind of compare these. And keeping in mind they all pay the same rate. Here's a mobile home park with 90 units, almost 10 acres, 233,000 square feet of impervious area, pays the same as the last property owner. Another multifamily project, quite a large apartment complex, 176 units, 7 acres of property, and 232,000 square feet of impervious area, also pays the same rate. Now on the commercial side, again, a lot of variability there. This is a kind of in a commercial complex here, and so the parcel really is just their unit. And this is a downtown mixed-use property at 0.06 acres, only 2,700 square feet of impervious area. Now, this is an example of a residential office that Andy was alluding to. So this is classified or zoned that way, residential office, but it's a commercial property. Sometimes these individuals have a home-based business, sometimes they don't. So this is just over an acre and 11,000 square feet of impervious area. Here's a large industrial property, zoned light industrial, 20-acre site, almost 800,000 square feet of impervious area. Would pay the same rate as the prior two examples. Now, public is a separate billing class, but just as an example here, this is one of your local high schools, 65 acres, 310,000 square feet of impervious area. So one of the options that we have is obviously just to keep things how they are, but increase the rates such that you get the revenue that you need. We're looking for about 64% more revenue than we currently receive, so it's a big jump. But here's an example of how that would look if you simply just kept everything, the rate classes how they are, and just increased the rates by 64%. So you can see how the jumps would occur there. Okay, another idea would be to modify the existing rate structure slightly to accomplish a little more equity among different property sizes. So if you look at, for example, the single-family property classification, you could set sort of the medium parcel size and then base small and large off of that, 50% high or low. And the same thing could be done for all the other properties, so that those that are smaller would get a little bit of a break, and those that were larger would pay a little more, but not to any extreme. I think they're all still pretty reasonable. And since we last presented this, I went through and did a little more analysis, and these are probably not exact, but they're a lot closer than they were when we last presented. So these would be, within the range of what they actually would look like if you chose to implement this method. Some of the pros and cons here, certainly more equitable than what's currently happening, would soften the blow to maybe some of the largest properties and those who have installed on-site improvements, and would be quite easy to administer. Wouldn't take much time to do the analysis for that. Little less detailed than some of the other methods we'll look at, and parcels with relatively low percentage of developed area are not receiving full credit under this method. Okay, now, so this is a new one, and is a result of some conversations that took place with staff and various interested community members and input we received at the public meeting. And I'd like to see if Andy, would you like to kind of introduce this? You kind of worked on this a little bit.
Yeah, this one, we called it tweaking the existing rate structure. It's kind of a little bit of a in-between on the modify, not just making a small, medium, large across to all of them, but also look at changing the billing method by the customer class. So like single-family property would stay flat, and would just, the numbers that are here were based on those previous slides, basically bumping 64% to, this was literally put together the day before we had to submit this, so didn't have enough time for Brent to do a real full analysis, but we did do kind of a back of the napkin look at it, and it comes up really close to the funds we need to generate, so we feel this is close. So for single family, like I said, that would be flat. For multifamily, look at actually billing by the units. So we'd bill at 50% of the single family. That's close to how we do flat rate on the sewer. So it'd be, same amount of work to administer that. And then we'd actually cap that on the top end. We put in 2 times the max commercial, but that could move. It'd be at that 2 times max commercial, it'd be roughly 42 units is where they'd hit that number. And that kind of counts for, like a duplex would have a similar impact to the system as a single family residence. And then we put in ag open public property, added essentially that ag and open space. We put in flat, although that could be looked at as being tiered by the size as well. That one looked at about half of what a commercial would be, and that could be looked at. Those properties are pretty small impact to the billing, as I showed earlier, less than 1% of that class. So, and then manufacturing and commercial, those would be tiered by parcel size. On the manufacturing, we set that minimum the same as what Brent showed in the previous slide for the modified, and maximum that same, $94.50. And then the commercial, Really only difference there would be that minimum that would basically be that converted home business or that home business type and would be the same as a single-family property. And then one other comment we received was on the single-family property and that low-income assistance program we're currently using with Fish for the sewer and water. Basically look at if it's possible to provide funding to Fish to administer a low-income rate assistance there, something on the order of maybe $20,000 a year. So again, this is a major concept at this point, but we'd need more analysis to kind of figure out where those tiers and actual fees would be, but we're close.
Okay. Some of the pros and cons with that one are similar to the other method we just looked at, the modified method. Again, achieves a little more equity than we currently have. It does involve some of the feedback that we've received from public, which is nice. Again, kind of helps those with the very largest properties not to have such a huge financial blow. And then with this ag and open space properties, it kind of puts those into a category of, like golf courses, that large properties, but not a lot of storm runoff and things like that. So that's kind of a nice touch. And then with the addition of the low-income assistance program, I think that's also nice for customers that are struggling with their finances and still quite easy to administer. It does perhaps lack some of the detail that a couple of the other methods have that we'll be looking at next, but it's still quite a simple rate structure. Okay, let's just review some of the other ones that we looked at. These are hard to read, I apologize, but what's shown there, this is the impervious area approach, and what's shown there is just a cross-section of different types of properties by class and size and things like that, because it does show, this is truly a pretty strict approach based on how much impervious area you have on your property. And so it's an easy calculation to make. But you can see the impact that it has, both plus and minus, for the very small. We looked at that one that was 0.06 acres. That tiny little commercial property, the bill would be like $362. It's very low compared to what they currently pay of like $41. And so on that end, it would really have an impact. But then on the other end, it has a major impact as well. If you look at the school that we looked at, 65-acre parcel with a lot of impervious area, big parking lot, their bill would go from $32 all the way up to $1,700, so it's a massive jump. And some of the public commented on that. This was not really well received, I would say, from the input that we've had. Just, schools, for example, or other public buildings having to budget for that. It would take quite some time to work that into their budget. And as we heard from this gentleman at the beginning, for business, could impact employment and other things like that. So this is by most measures,
Brett,
I'm
can
sorry,
we
go ahead.
back for just a minute
Mm-hmm.
on that previous slide?
Yeah.
The 200 million square feet there of impervious area, how was that determined?
Yeah, thank you. If this method were to progress further, we'd have to do some analysis there. But what we did, the city looked at this method back in, I think it was like 2001, 2, and they did an actual GIS layer type calculation and came up with a pretty solid number. So we used just a kind of a rate of growth for that since then to come up with an estimate. It's a good question.
Thank you.
So a fairly equitable structure, although in the cons you'll see that and this was brought up by the public as well, that at least in its current form, it doesn't offer any credit for those that have done on-site storm detention. And I think Bruce commented on that last time we were here, is that there are programs that do that, and there's a way to build that into this rate structure if that was something that was desirable. But in this current approach, that's not considered. It is a little more difficult to administer, obviously. You have a lot of upfront calculations to do, and then continually, if people submit a change to their property, you have to look at it again. And so it's quite a bit of staff time in implementing this and maintaining it over time. And of course, the larger properties get hit really hard and have to make some tough business decisions, I think. Okay, keeping with the impervious approach, but doing something to kind of moderate the impact. You can see the existing rate structure above, and of course, that's actually how it is today. Not factoring in the 64% increase that we need, but down below is a possible structure where you would sort of group properties by the amount of impervious area that they have. And so you'd have kind of this concept of small, medium, large. And again, I looked at this, did some rough analysis, and these numbers are fairly close to what they might look like if we did something like this based on size of. Now, this is not the size of the parcel, but it's the amount of impervious area on the parcel. And so you can see how that would look, where it caps out at $248 versus some of the largest that would go over $1,000. This kind of helps to moderate that a little bit. And this is a lot to absorb here just by looking at this chart, but you can look at some of the examples that we used before, that very small parcel, that commercial parcel that was less than 1/10 of an acre. Instead of paying $362, they'd pay $31, but it's less than the $41 that they currently pay. So they get a bit of a break there. But on the upside with the largest parcels, instead of paying $1,700, the school would pay $248. So a large break for them there. So here we tried to find some middle ground, more equity, but softening the blow to the large properties and also giving a break to some of the smallest of the properties. Maybe not as equitable as the strict version of the impervious area, but still a little difficult to administer because you still have to come up with the impervious area. So that's going to take time and staff to do that. Before I get to that, so those are that's an overview of the approaches. All of those were presented to the public with the exception of that one that Andy and staff worked on that was presented here today. I don't know if you want to wait till the end to comment. We thought maybe, I think you were provided in your packet the public comments, and I mean, generally speaking, there weren't a lot of public that attended the meeting, but there were public that came forward after and called or met with staff. And generally speaking, the comments weren't really in favor of the impervious area method, maybe because of the concern for impact of business in the community. However, we really only had one public member there that was just an interested resident, so not a lot of voice there, but there were also a few people that came forward after concerned about just how to plan for their budget, so there were people that were responsible for budgets of their business or other things, condos and apartments, that would say, well, I just need to know what this is so I can plan for it in my annual budget, things like that. But you've got those comments, and if you had anything you wanted to discuss, we could do that. I think is that it, Andy? So time for questions.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Andy. I'll bring it back to the committee for questions, comments. Go ahead.
Just a point of clarification to Andy or Brent. There's reference in one of the earlier slides to 1.8 million from existing rates and then a 1.938. Is that just an update?
Yeah, that's an update of budget, basically. It's some grant funding, things like that, I think, is what that difference was.
And Chairman, if one more? Sure. I'm struck, and I apologize if I'm covering old ground, having missed the last meeting, but on this impervious area approach, if you imagined a city that had no impervious area at all, we'd still be looking at a stormwater budget. Has there been some analysis done as to what percentage of the problem is created by impervious areas? I mean, it seems to me that, having lived here for a long time, that we have the floods, it's all this water coming out of the canyons, and then added to runoff within the city, within the developed city. Did that weigh into your considerations at all, or has that analysis been done? Thank you.
No, I don't think we've analyzed it quite that way. That's the simple answer, but it's a great point. There are parts of this program that would probably still exist without impervious area and runoff, like flood control, things like that. The impervious areas do contribute to water quality issues, and the need for infrastructure for just, regular storm drainage infrastructure and things like that. So your point's well taken. I think there's probably elements of the program that would exist either way.
Just to follow up on that, looking at that 10-year capital improvement program, it looked like a lot of those big ticket items had to do with work up in the canyons, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you, Bob. I'm just going to go down the line. Bruce?
Well, yeah, I've got some thoughts and ideas, but my suggestion would be that we listen to public comments and hear what they have to say. We kind of had a crack at this last time, but your call, Mr. Chair. I'll reserve the opportunity to comment later if I may.
Appreciate that. I'm going to go down the line first, and I will open it up to public comment. Randy, you have anything to add?
I do. Thanks, Mike. Going back to one of the slides that you brought up, Brent, was the municipal code right now requires that a stormwater rate be based on, among other things, each parcel of developed real property and based on majority of zoning classification. So what caught my eye when I reread that was, number one, it's developed real property. And I'm assuming undeveloped property is still going to be charged a stormwater fee, whether it's the existing system or some hybrid proposal in the future that we're considering.
Yeah, as really even an undeveloped, you're going to have some level of runoff, minor, but.
The only reason I bring it up is I want to be clear when we go through the consideration is if we're talking about, as the code says, develop real property or not.
Yeah, and when I looked at the billing database, it seemed to me that there were some properties that were able to get, if they were to call in or work with the city, that they might get a waiver. Is that true? I mean, I thought there were some that maybe were able to opt out because they were undeveloped, for example. But I'm not clear exactly how that's handled across the board. But it's a great point, in terms of being consistent with the policy. And so might just need to do a little research and look at how it's currently handled and then how we would accommodate to be consistent, or maybe it requires a change in policy. I don't know.
So really depending on what the recommendation is to the Board of Supervisors, number one, and secondly, what they adopt, it may require some adjustment to that element of the code.
Great comment.
Not to get too far in the weeds, but if these undeveloped parcels are not receiving a water or a sewer bill, how would you go about billing them for stormwater? I mean, would they just get a separate stormwater bill?
I should know this, and I don't. It's just been too long since I looked at it. But I believe Brent is right that we started out billing them, and then we've since stopped billing undeveloped parcels. But we'll get that answered for you.
Thank you, Randy. Anything else?
Building on the issue of zoning, My understanding is zoning and current land use can be two different things, or it could be the same. For example, if an undeveloped parcel is zoned commercial, number one, I guess my question is, can that happen? And number two, if it does happen, is that undeveloped, commercially zoned parcel being charged the commercial stormwater rate?
Yeah, that potential is there. And I think that's a couple of the examples that Brent talked about. I believe we have at least one ag property that's zoned commercial, but currently paying the single family, because that's the use. That was a historical bring-in.
If the stormwater rate is not based on zoning, but more accurately on land use, would that incorporate more parity with the impervious surface?
I think the answer
I
is
guess
yes.
to put it in fine focus,
Yep.
should we be billing on zoning or current land use?
Well, and I think, again, when I looked at the database, there was some of that in there, like someone would come forward and say, well, but our property is, we got this big piece, but it's mostly just grass and a little house, ag or something. And so they got a break, got charged like the single family. So there's people that have had those things that have been modified. And so you see that throughout the database. But certainly if you're looking at equity there, depending on the method you choose, land use is probably, something you'd want to look at.
And to add to that, there's been some more recent examples with multifamily. That's been kind of the development push on the residential side, where it's been commercial properties, that's an allowed use with a planned unit development approval. So the base zoning would still be commercial. That's how it shows up in the billing database, but there's a manual override to change that to multifamily because of that approval.
At this point in the analysis of the various rate structures, is it possible to look at land use as opposed to zoning in determining the stormwater rate, recognizing that the current code states zoning?
Do we have enough data on land use to?
I mean, who keeps track of land use? Is that a descriptor that we actually tie to a parcel?
It is.
It is. So, I mean, it's just as simple to differentiate as zoning of a parcel.
Right. We have categories, we have maps that state what the land use is, so we could go back and change anything, that was on zoning and change it to land use, probably. I don't think, I think there's a difference, but I don't think there's gonna be a big difference. There's gonna be certain, a handful of them that, are gonna change based on land use that we haven't already manually changed in the system, in terms of ones that are still hanging out there. But that's not what this model isn't based off of that currently.
Looking at the suggestions of the modified existing versus the tweaked, not to be confused with the modified, and then the grouped impervious area. There's two separate categories, one for manufacturing and one for commercial. I guess my question is, what's the big difference between those two as far as rate structure? And number two, why not just combine the two into a single category?
It's a great question, and I've had similar thoughts about that, because this, this structure's been around for quite a while, and I don't know that anyone really even knows how those came about to begin with, but it's a great point. I mean, I don't know what the difference is, honestly, in terms of the use of the property or the type of the, property there. You can look at them and a lot of them looks the same, really. So I think that could be done. Am I missing something there, Darren? I mean, yeah.
Can I keep rolling?
You got a list going, you might as well.
On several of the various scenarios for developing the rates, undeveloped areas or those parcels that are open space, that is, as Bob had mentioned previously, there's still going to be runoff on open space. But in my mind, if they're going to be charged the same rate as any other, for example, the large impervious surface area that the high school has, we've got a golf course. That's what we want. We want the stormwater, the precipitation to go back into the ground and recharge the groundwater system. But they're going to be paid, or they're going to be assessed a stormwater rate the same as other large impervious surface zoning or other land uses. I think that's an observation, and I really think there has to be a little bit more equity between an impervious surface and an open space or ag land. One final observation is in 2001, Hector Sear was the consultant on that study. And if I'm not mistaken, in your review of that, the recommendation was that the most equitable approach is impervious surface. And looking at the material you've presented, Brent, it looks as though impervious surface area continues to be the most equitable. An observation, but it looks like we're back validating the initial conclusion of the 2001 study. So it looks as though all we're doing now is to make it more palatable for the public. When I say public, I fully recognize, and I think that's a great graphic where you show 91% of the ratepayers are residential. So the analysis that we're doing and tweaking or modifying or grouping impervious areas is primarily for 9% of the ratepayers. Is that correct?
That's a fair statement.
Okay. That's all I have.
That's it. Well, thanks, Randy. Jeff, do you have anything to add?
So I agree with a lot of the observations that have already been made. Some of those things that I had jotted down have already been discussed. The approach that I, at this time, seem to like best, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of things here, but the grouped impervious area approach seems to me, something that we could work with for sure. I'm just curious, kind of along the lines that Randy was talking about, obviously there is still some subsidizing going on. I'm just curious to what degree that is actually happening under the grouped impervious area.
Yeah, it's a good question. It definitely is happening. There'll be some in maybe that large parcel where some will pay more than what they would otherwise if it was just based on the impervious area, and some will pay a fair amount less. And so you're going to see both ends of that spectrum. But, since they're grouped in a large group already, it's not as bad as it would be if like it currently is, where, you've got somebody paying, all those parcels are paying $40, where some of them should be paying $1,700. So it helps, but you're right, there's still a subsidy happening in each one of those groups.
And what about the residential group?
Yeah, so residential is tough. I mean, there was some public comment about, kind of making different, like we had one method there that showed where you could have 3 different prices for residential based on, small, medium, and large size parcels. So you could still mix that in if you wanted to. That was a comment we received at the public hearing.
Yeah. But overall, the amount of subsidizing that the residential customer is doing is reduced under this approach?
Yeah, because you're collecting more from the larger parcels.
proportionately.
Yeah.
I think that's all I have at this point.
Thank you, Jeff. I'll go through my thoughts, and then I'd like to open it up to public comment to hear the public's thoughts who have joined us today, and then I'll bring it back to the committee for some final wrap-up and hopefully some recommendations to staff. First off, going back in history, from my perspective, we tried we recommended to the Board of Supervisors back around 2017, it was mentioned, for an increase that would get us to the $3.2 million or so in revenue. At the time, the Board of Supervisors granted roughly a third of that increase with a recommendation to staff to go back and do a rate study, which is what we're doing right now, to come up with a more equitable solution. So with that frame in mind, going back to, I think, Randy's point about the impervious area and the grouped impervious area that's the most equitable, so to speak, and that's reaching the conclusion of that's meeting the goals of the Board of Supervisors. I also recognize there's a tremendous amount of effort that's going to go into administering this process, that's going to add burden and overhead to the process. That's probably not really adding a whole lot of value to the process. And at the end of the day, the burdens that we put on either the public space, the commercial, or the manufacturer is going to end up coming back out of the residents' pockets anyways by way of increased prices at the gas station or the restaurant or the car lot, or even in property taxes through school district. So I don't know if the goal of being entirely equitable is necessary. But I still think it's something that we should try to strive for some level of equality. I do like the idea of adding in an ag land and open space. While I recognize they're not huge generators, and Randy pointed out that they are maybe helping in most events, storm events, from a stormwater runoff standpoint. They do generate runoff, and it is an area where we need to be able to provide some improvements for and some maintenance on. So I would be interested in, I guess, seeing an ag breakout for that. I like the idea of combining manufacturing and commercial. And then the last bit that I had written down is, while I think the study is, it's providing very good feedback, very good insight to how we're generating our revenue now. One of the things that's really striking to me is we're aiming at this one $3.2 million number, which I think is great for probably year one, but what does it look like at year two, and what is our need for year three and year four, and so on. And I haven't seen any discussion on indexing. I'm not sure if it's been thought about in the rate study, but I think it's something that we need to consider, whether we're indexing to some known value or just recognizing that we need to have regular revisits of what our stormwater rates, and for that fact, all of the utility rates need to be. I think
Can I respond to that,
Yeah,
Mike?
go ahead.
It's a great point. Andy and I spent a little time to develop just in an Excel spreadsheet, which would be like just a little financial model for the stormwater utility to double check if the 3.2 million is still a good number, because that was several years back. And with the CIP that's been developed, it turns out that it is. It'll work just fine for the CIP. But to your point, in the model, because your O&M costs are going to go up from year one, we did build in like a CPI type inflation index to be built in. So that'll probably be coming forward as a recommendation. We'll need that to be able to keep pace with increased costs.
Great, thank you for that. So that's all I have to add at this point. With that, I'll open it up to public comment. Anybody who's joining us today like to add anything?
Got it? Oh, I'm Mark Gand. I'm with Western Nevada College. We've got about 200 acres up there, about 55 or so are developed. So I'm really not prepared to tell you which one of these proposals would have, or how each one of these proposals would affect us. But we're going to go back to the college and really analyze that, and we'll submit a letter, because a couple of these look frightening to us. But anyway, that's all I have to say, and thank you. It's been interesting today.
Thank you for that. No, you got to push the button.
All right, there we are. I've got the green light. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. I have had conversations with both Darren and Andy regarding the so-called tweak proposal. I am a property owner, but also the maintenance director for the Southgate Shopping Center, which is the J.C. Penney Burlington Center at the south end of Carson. When we developed the property back in the early 1990s, we were required to dedicate over 1.6 acres of general commercial property for a detention basin. In our center, there are no fewer than 15 drop inlets. And I would hazard a guess that based on an average storm, contribution of an average storm to the detention basin, that we are retaining nearly 100% of that water due to the elevated nature of the outlet. So in my conversations with staff, I noticed that this, especially the one that you've been discussing, I think in earnest, which is a modified version of the impervious coverage approach, that there doesn't appear to be any credit given to detention basins that have been built expressly for the purpose of retaining and infiltrating water on site. And I think that's significant. I see a lot of projects around town today that don't seem to have, there doesn't appear to be any attempt to infiltrate. And I think we need to, in the future, maybe look outside the box. I've spent a lot of time in the Tahoe Basin, working in the Tahoe Basin, and working with regional planners. And there are techniques like pervious pavement, for example, especially in small properties that don't have the luxury of dedicating large acreage to infiltration basins. I mean, there are approaches. I think we need to look at the state of the art of infiltrating water more effectively in all of our developments in town, so that we don't continually have this conversation year after year when we find shortfalls in the budget related to stormwater infrastructure development. So as I indicated to staff, listen, nobody likes to travel across flooded streets. We all benefit to some degree, whether we're infiltrating 100% of our runoff or not, from having streets that are clear of stormwater and being able to negotiate our way around town freely. But I would recommend that whatever, first of all, if it is the grouped, or whatever the alternative was described as, but kind of the modified impervious coverage alternative, that you do give some sort of credit to properties that have functional detention basins and that are doing a good job of infiltrating the water that they produce as a result of impervious coverage. But I would also recommend that you give staff a little bit of flexibility, and this is really not, I suppose, under your purview. It would be under the purview of the Board of Supervisors, to allow them to entertain situations where there are extenuating circumstances, whether it be a detention basin that infiltrates 100% of the water, or ag lands that actually infiltrate a substantial amount of water, especially, I mean, that's what wetlands were designed to do, right? And there are projects around town, just as there are in every community, that should never have been developed. And I'm in the development business, but you look at the cause and effect, and you look at the consequences of consuming those ag lands or those wetlands, which are designed to be natural filters for the water, for the runoff that comes out of the mountains. And I think that we all, in hindsight, would probably have done things differently. So I think that staff needs a little bit of flexibility to deal with these issues on a case-by-case basis, outside of the whatever sort of system you design. I think we need to remain a little bit flexible, a little bit fungible, so that we can take those differences into account. So if there are any questions for me, I'm willing to answer them. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. I know this is very difficult, and it's going to be difficult to find a system that is acceptable to everyone. We're willing to pay something, obviously, even though I believe we've done a good job of infiltrating our water. But as I say, there is a broader holistic benefit to the community. And so we are prepared to pay something, probably not $1,700 a month, but something slightly more than we're paying now. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Anybody else that'd like to make a comment under public comment? Seeing none, I will close public comment then and bring it back to the committee. Bruce, you didn't get a chance to speak last time.
Yeah, I appreciate the public comments, both earlier as well as now. I guess a couple thoughts from my perspective. We're really focused on who's generating this runoff. And I think we have to keep in mind who benefits from a storm drain utility and the improvements and the mitigation effects of what that utility might do. And, you know, those benefits are scattered all over Carson City, depending on where you are, or in some cases, if you're on King Street, what side of the street you're on. A lot of variations. And I think, in my mind, that is part of the reason that I don't see absolute equity in impervious surfaces. I think we have to look a little bit past that. I think the residential component is a big component of our customers, so to speak, but I think many of those residents are gaining a benefit even though they may not generate a whole lot of runoff. When I look at the residents, they're taxpayers, but at the same time, the commercial and industrial manufacturing folks are taxpayers as well. And they are obviously offering not only the taxes they pay, but they're also creating jobs and bringing other benefits to the community. And I think it's important to recognize that they bring more in some respects than a residential unit does as far as the community and the community's well-being, assuming we're approving good manufacturing or good commercial uses. So I think giving the commercial, industrial, manufacturing people some consideration in that regard is reasonable. I don't find it unreasonable at all to do it on an absolute runoff equity basis, because I don't think runoff is really, in many ways, equitable. It looks good, but I think there's a lot more to it. I think we have to be especially careful of the impacts on some of our large public users, primarily the school district and the college. They do a lot of things for the community. They potentially can be part of the solution in detention, in retention, in other impacts because they have large parcels. And so I think it's fair in my mind to recognize them in a way that's a little bit more than perhaps somebody else with an equally large piece of property. I really think we should develop an incentive for commercial everybody to do what Shelley Aldine has just suggested that they've done at Southgate, which is create detention, create retention, and provide a significant benefit in the fees that might be associated with that. Some people have already done it. Some people may have the opportunity to do it. But I think that merits a significant change for those properties as an incentive to have those property owners, developers, manufacturers create a little bit of a detention capability. I think the idea of supporting, kind of like we do with water and sewer, low-income low-income residents is important. We have folks that are struggling to stay in their houses, and I think if we can help with this utility bill, just like we do for a relatively small number but a very needy group of people, I certainly support that. So I think the modified proposal is moving things in a better direction. I think we have to be careful about hitting people too hard. I think we really ought to consider the possibility of recommending some sort of a phased-in for the adjustment. And very honestly, I think indexing makes some sense in a carefully, well thought out way. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Bruce. I agree with a lot of those. I would like to come back to the committee and I guess we need to be able to formulate a recommendation back to staff as to whether we either like one of the proposed approaches and we recommend moving forward, or we want to see one or two of the proposed methods further examined and maybe come back with a more refined, actually give Brent some direction as to dial in on what those actual proposed increases would be, and then that way we can make a recommendation back to the Board of Supervisors. Darren, Andy, I think we talked a little bit briefly before the meeting about timing. Can you elaborate what your timing is or what your thoughts on timing are for this?
Yes, so we're, as much as we want to make this fund sustainable and, self-funded and get ourselves out of the red in terms of our financial policies, we understand that these things do take time. So what our fiscal year is July to June, but there's a lot of, once we even get the go-ahead to move forward with a new rate design and increase rates, there's a lot of steps that have to take place. So we're thinking probably the soonest that there could be some sort of a new rate in effect would be January of 21. So then you back up from there, and eventually this will go to the Board of Supervisors. I would expect at least 2 times just to get worked out what the model should, or the methodology and how we should go. And then after that, we do several hearings of business impact statements, that sort of thing. So that would all happen, sometime next year, calendar year 2020. So in terms of timing for this committee, we're prepared for a recommendation to go to the BOS, but it doesn't mess up the timing if you want to spend some more time on this and further evaluate what's been presented today, and we have another meeting specifically for this. That doesn't impact the overall timing.
All right, thank you, Darren. I think with that in mind then, since all of these are really concepts, I would like to not make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors today. I would like us to identify one or two of the methods that are preferred. And if you have some ads or you want to see some more detail in them, I think that's what we should direct staff to proceed with. So with that, Bruce, you want to take this
Question
charge of that? Yeah?
for staff. Does the tweaked rate reflect, as far as you're aware, the comments and the feedback you've had since our last meeting? Is that a fair statement, or is that stretching it?
I would say that's a fair statement. That's how we tried to build that. It's based on comments.
Okay, then, we can do this like we started comments last time. If you, the members have a preferred alternative or some areas that they'd like to see further vetted in any of the alternatives, I'd like to hear it. Bob, if you're, be so brave to start.
Thank you, Mike. Well, I would, having heard the discussion, I would like to see further elaboration on the tweaked existing rate structure and then the grouped impervious area approach as well. And with maybe, and it was unclear to me as to the percentage split of the revenue requirement really on the grouped impervious between what had to do with parcel size and what had to do with impervious area covered. But those are the two that I would like to see a little more elaboration on. And I would also, concur with the comments by Randy and Bruce of combining commercial and manufacturing. Which just looking at the existing rate structure, and it doesn't make sense to me to maintain that, those two different categories. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Bruce, you want to take a stab?
Yeah, I guess my thought would be to consider moving forward with the little more detail on the tweaked structure, and also some outreach to some of the major parties who would be impacted by the changes to make sure that we have at least made every effort possible to get their input, should that be the recommendation going forward.
Thank you, Bruce. Randy, if you don't mind, I'm going to go next, since I'm in line here. Bob, I appreciate the grouped impervious approach. I'm going to switch from that. I like the modified existing rate structure. And the reason for that is I think there's a lot of overhead that's going to go into calculating and keeping up on what that impervious area is going to be. And my goal is to not add administrative costs that are going to take away from ultimately O&M in the field and capital improvements in the field. And I'd also like to see some further refinement of the tweaked existing rate structure. I'd like to see a combination of manufacturing and commercial in one. I'd like to see ag land and open space. I know that was already in the tweaked, but it was not in the modified existing rate structure. On the concept of adding in credits for LID and porous pavement, retention, detention, I absolutely appreciate all that, but again, I think that if we get too deep, goes at the detriment of taking resources away from the goal of generating more revenue, which, because we have to have somebody be able to calculate and determine what those values are. If you could add in some structure that could easily do that, or like Shelley had mentioned, provide some flexibility to staff to be able to go in and easily make modifications as need be. And I'd also like to see the impacts or the effects of indexing on both of those. That's my 2 cents. Randy?
Thanks. I apologize for doing this, but with, as Andy said, there's 5 different alternatives we're looking at. And Dana, you said that you preferred one of those, and I'm not clear which one. Tweaked? Okay, thank you. I really appreciate you folks coming forward and offering comments. It's easy to come up with an objection. It's tougher to come up with a solution, so I appreciate that. And poor Mark with WNC, you see this and you go, holy moly. And that's your comment. I can appreciate that. There's a lot to it. And Shelley, I think, you made some great comments, and I think, as Mike said, they should be incorporated. You brought them up, although, Mike, you felt it might be a little bit more burdensome from an administrative standpoint. My perspective is I think it's important to incorporate them. Because again, we're looking at adjustments of, for 9% or the non-residential element as opposed to the residential element. And I think it's, and when staff and Brent from Far West says, when we look at the impervious surface, I'm making a bold assumption here, and if it's incorrect, let me know, that analysis level of impervious surface area is for non-residential, or would you also be looking at residential? Or you don't know at this point?
Well, so far, the way residential's handled is the way it was recommended in that 2001 study, where they did an analysis of a certain number of parcels and determined that the average was 3,600 square feet of impervious. And so we wouldn't have to study those. We just assume that that's That's what it's based on.
Okay, and that's pretty much what I had figured. So any detailed analysis of impervious surface area would primarily be on non-residential, or 9% of the number of ratepayers. And I don't view that as too much of a burden. Maybe initially setting up a rate system like that, but certainly not ongoing. I agree with Shelley's comment of incorporating some degree of flexibility for staff to administer the program. I think credits for on-site improvements and low-impact development, or LID, would be fruitful. And as far as the systems that are under consideration, I lean towards grouped impervious surface areas first, and then secondly, probably the tweaked. And I would actually, I'd buttress what Bruce's comment was, that there has to be outreach. There's a reason why we're doing things, and I think those reasons have to be communicated to the public.
Thank you, Randy. Jeff?
So, first of all, Brent and staff, appreciate all the work you guys have done on this, and it's obviously not an easy job. I do think, as Mike pointed out, that we need a little more work before we're ready to truly make a recommendation at this point. Like Randy, I'm kind of leaning right now towards the grouped impervious area approach. And also a close second would probably be the tweaked method. I like the comments that the public has made, and my fellow members on the committee, I agree with pretty much everything that's been said. I like the idea of incentives for developers. One thing we didn't talk a whole lot about was the low income assistance, possibly using fish. I like that idea. Maybe we can look at incorporating that into whatever approach we finally decide on. And I'm totally fine with combining the manufacturing and commercial. That seems to make sense. Phased-in approach makes a lot of sense when you're looking at some fairly significant impacts to some customer groups. And I think the indexing also makes a lot of sense. So we are back here 2 years from now redoing this. So that's basically where I stand at this point.
Thank you, Jeff. Going through those, I think what I heard was generally a consensus, certainly on the tweaked. I got to make sure I'm getting my terminology right here. The tweaked existing rate structure, and then the grouped impervious approach was the second one. I can support that. If there's not any further discussion, I'll open it up for further discussion if there isn't any. Go ahead, Bruce.
Just one minor thing. I'm not sure, if I said it, I didn't mean to imply combining the commercial and manufacturing, because I think we get some substantially different sized parcels there. So I want to make sure that, if they may have a similar rate at smaller levels, but I think, I'm not sure if those can be effectively combined. I don't mind looking at that, but I think to some degree, we may have different things going there, and maybe it's just a size separation. But I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. If there's no other comments on that, questions on that, I'd entertain a motion. And I'm going to throw out that there's probably enough information in the minutes that staff can have all of our little adds added, that it doesn't have to be all-encompassing in the motion.
Let me jump in at this point.
Okay.
The agenda item for you is to make a recommendation to the board. So if you desire to make a recommendation to the board, then a motion is certainly appropriate. If you, from what I've gathered, that's not your desire, then at this point, no motion is necessary, no action is necessary, and you can essentially table the item and until staff has a chance to come back with your modified plans.
I appreciate that insight. With that, then I think I'd be looking for a motion to table the agenda item so staff could come back with further refined options that we discussed.
Mr. Chairman, I would make the motion that we do just that with the request to staff that at their convenience and, certainly as quickly as possible to move it along from the perspective of the process, that staff refine and bring back or provide for comment to the committee. Adjustments or changes reflecting the comments you've heard today, which may in fact reduce it down to a couple possibilities, but I would make that motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for that motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Randy seconded. I don't think I need to have any more comment, do I, for discussion? No? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye?
Aye.
Opposed? None, 5-0. Thank you, everyone, for that. Thank you, Brent. With that, then, I guess we're moving on to item 2B, which is an information item only, as presentation on fiscal year 19 financial review and regards updates on revenues and expenditures for water, wastewater, and stormwater funds. Pam? Pam, you want to maybe wait 30 seconds?
Thank you. Pam Ganger, Deputy Chief Financial Officer. If it looks like I'm crying at any point, it's my allergies, so just ignore. I'm here to provide an update on our fiscal year, so June 30th, 2019 financials for wastewater, water, and stormwater utility funds. So we'll begin with the wastewater fund. Please keep in mind that all of these numbers are draft year-to-date numbers when we're talking about June 30, 2019. Our annual audit is currently wrapping up, but it's still not yet complete at this point. So there could be changes to these numbers, although I don't at this point anticipate any significant changes. Again, starting with our wastewater fund, you'll notice that our total revenue is $16.9 million so far for June 30th. The most significant increases over our budget this year is in connection fees. We saw a significant increase in multifamily properties this year. There could be more other impacts in there as well, commercial, but I think the biggest primarily was multifamily. We had quite a bit of investment income to allocate out to the funds this year, which was great. So we saw a big increase there. And then I want to point out an error in this schedule, grant revenue, the far right column where it says dollar change. It says $324,957. That should be a negative. So in parentheses right there. As you can see, our year-to-date number is $519. We had budgeted for $325,000 in grant revenue coming in. These were related to federal grants for generators, and we just haven't seen the reimbursement monies for those yet. We'll have the same on the water fund, as you'll see later. Overall, expenditures were under budget, and we had a net increase in net position of $3.6 million overall. Please stop me at any time if there are questions. This slide reviews how we're doing in our financial policies for the wastewater fund. And the wastewater fund is looking fairly well. As you can see that we are meeting all of our goals in our financial policies for the wastewater fund. Moving on to the...
Question real quick.
Sure.
Pam, a couple quick things.
Okay.
On the fiscal summary, what are BAB credits?
BAB credits.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for your thorough answer.
Those are in reference to our 2010 water bond credits that we get for the bonds that we had in place. And I'm sorry, this is the wastewater fund, so we have it both on the wastewater fund and on the water fund. So we get a little bit of money back from the feds on this fund, and that's what that is.
Okay, and then the second thing, I probably should remember, but I don't. We have 45 days of operating expenses
Right.
under wastewater and storm drain, and 60 days underwater.
Correct.
I don't recall why we have a difference.
Okay, so the difference pertained to the financial policies that were written based on typical standards in the utility industry and what was recommended by FCFs, who did our last rate study, as you recall. And that is why the difference.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so moving on to the water fund. For fiscal 19, we're currently seeing $18 million in total revenues. The biggest increases over budget that we saw there was in charges for services. We probably had some extra usage in there that we didn't budget for. Our investment income, as mentioned before, with the wastewater fund, across all the funds across the city, actually, we had significant investment income this year. So we saw increases there everywhere. Connection fees, again, are up. And once again, here we see this fund in particular had a bigger hit with the expected revenues for grant revenue related to those generations. And once again, that's timing, and that'll roll into fiscal 20. So hopefully we'll see that money then. Overall, in this fund as well, we saw a decrease of expenses, not a decrease of expenses, but, well, slight decrease overall, but we were under budget with all expense categories here. So our net increase in this fund and net position is $4.9 million. And then taking a look at our water fund financial policies, the only policy that we're not in line with in this fund is the debt to equity ratio, which we fully expected. We have our $10 million water bond crossover refunding, which we will pay off in, I believe it's May of 2020 this year. So our cash in this fund is significantly higher than it ordinarily would be because we are holding those bond monies until we pay off that bond in May of 2020.
Is that, in the estimated 19, the capital reserve, that number is, it seems an outlier. Is that part of that?
Repeat the question?
Well, so in layman's terms, I guess, the green bar is very tall compared to the 2018 number.
Now you're down to the committee.
That's our
Right,
capital.
right.
So right. So and that's in reference to our capital. So our goal in that category is calculated based on a percentage of our capital assets. Okay, so our goal is only 2% of our capital assets, and that is is what we hope to see meet or exceed that goal at the end of the fiscal year. And in this case, the bar is very high. And as I mentioned, that pertains to the cash balances being very, very high at this point in time because we are holding, at the end of fiscal year 19, we had $10 million in crossover bond monies that will be gone in May of fiscal 20. And in addition to that, we also still had $7 million in bond monies that we had not started spending yet. At this point in time, I think that project is wrapping up, so a lot of that money will have diminished.
Okay, so
But yes, that's why the bar is so high.
it's bond proceeds, bond revenue that hasn't been spent and it's being held in cash is why that's such a jump right now.
That is, right now, that is exactly right. Yes, if you look at actual for 2018 and 17 and 16, you can see that that's, this is an extraordinary year.
Yes,
so,
okay.
in that regard.
Thank you.
Okay, so on to the stormwater fund. We're looking at total revenues in stormwater of $2 million or so at the end of June. And once again, we see an increase in, slight increase in charges for services and then a bigger increase in investment income. We were under budget in all of our expense categories again, and our increase in net position in the stormwater fund is looking to be about $695,000. And once again, as you can see here, the green bar is very tall. At the end of fiscal 18, we had some bond monies that were not yet spent, and those bond monies are still, as of the end of June, still unspent at this point in time. And that pertains to the timing of when the Public Works Department is able to work on those projects that they have lined up for this particular fund.
Is that a project that is holding it back or multiple projects, Andy?
So I will defer that question to Darren.
Darren?
Yeah, it's multiple projects, but the big one is South Carson. There's almost $4 million stormwater going to South Carson.
Thank you.
So the stormwater fund usually doesn't convey as pretty a picture as the other funds, and you can see here that our debt-to-equity ratio is not meeting its financial policy goals, and that, our debt-to-service coverage ratio is looking okay, and because our cash is so high right now, we are meeting the other goals, but that's just because we have such a high cash balance and we haven't spent those bond proceeds yet, so. And that's all I have. Are there any other questions?
Seeing none. Thank you, Pamela. And by the way, that layman's description of green bar, that was because I didn't know how else to describe it, so.
No problem.
Makes sense.
With that, we move on to item 2C, which is information, presentation and discussion of manager's report on personnel projects and planning. Darren.
All right, well, I'll get started here. Andy's done quite a bit of talking today, so switch it up. Eddie Qualieri, Water Utility Manager. Good afternoon. So in the water division, we've had one retirement under staff. Jeff Foltz, who's our water production operator 4. That's on the production side, so the treatment side. He put in his retirement for November 21st. So we're currently soliciting for that operator 4 position right now. We also had a meter technician move on from us, and we have that job position open right now. So moving on to, those are the staff updates. I'll move on to the current capital improvement projects. East-west 24-inch transmission main that the bond monies we were just talking about are going towards. That project's working its way up through town that you've seen. We're passed through Washington now. Got through a lot of difficult spots there, difficult utility crossings, some connections that we made. Now we're through Anderson's property, working our way towards Longview Way, where the booster pump station will be going. And then we're going to be, they're going to be kicking off towards Quill, probably make that connection in December timeframe. And that's another difficult connection to make due to Quill serving a particular pressure zone. So we're working on, taking that zone offline so we can make the connection. But we're working through all that right now. So the project's going really well. The contractor's doing a great job, and the public have been great to work with so far. So it's good to get through Washington and the busy section. So moving on to well 3 redrill over on Winnie. You probably saw the...
Before you move on to well 3, I have received a lot of questions or comments that the water line work that was done up Washington was to benefit the vintage Anderson Ranch property. Can you speak to that at all?
I did hear something about that, and that is not true, or it's for a whole system improvement. It's bringing the town of Minden, our water rights in the town of Minden wells up to the Quill zone to where our treatment plant is. From that zone, we can move it throughout the entire system, so up to the ash tanks up in Ash Canyon. That zone also feeds the booster pump stations that go up to Timberline zone and the Lakeview zone. So it's to get that water that we started, the transmission main. It's the last phase of that project to spread the water throughout the whole town, or give us the ability to. We'll still be able to supply the 4880 zone, which is the lower valley zone where we are right now, with that water, but this project will just get that water up to the zones where we can disperse it more readily. So that's what the project's for.
Thank you.
If I just may add, to give you a little more, I'll just say it, ammunition to anybody's reply. This project was designed and started construction well before development on the west side of Carson City in terms of that pipeline going up through Washington to Quill. It had nothing to do, we didn't know any about these developments back 12 years ago when we designed this project. So it was well in advance of that.
Thank you both.
Okay, so moving on, well 3, you probably saw the drill rig out there for a month or two. We successfully drilled a great production well there. We were limited on our last well. The well before this well telescoped down. It was just the way they designed it. It was cheaper to build. This well is a full 18-inch well all the way down to the lower aquifer, and we've gone from a test or a production ability about 700 gallons per minute from the last well to our hydrogeologist gave us a recommendation to pump it at about 2,500. So it was a major increase over the last well, and it will be a very good production well, emergency well for that area. We're looking at all sorts of possibilities on it as being a huge asset to us. So it's a really successful project, and it's not in production yet. We still have to put the actual pump and motor in and the building around the pump and motor. So it's just a hole in the ground and, constructed well at this point. So we're looking at equipping it in the spring of next year. So that project's underway right now.
Eddie?
Yes.
When you say 2,500 gallons per minute, is that viewed as the capacity, or will that be the pumping rate once it's established?
So that would be I guess both, to answer your question. It's
so you're going to pump it at a maximum rate?
It's the recommended pumping rate so that there aren't any effects to any other wells around in the area. So it's the pumping rate where the cone of depression of the groundwater table isn't affected over time.
So during normal operations, you would pump it at that maximum rate?
We would, yeah. We
Okay.
could. And we're looking at putting in a variable frequency drive so that we could vary the rate of pumping. But that's the allowable rate that the hydrogeologist said that wouldn't have an effect on the groundwater table, is at that 2,500 gallon per minute. So that's what we're going to design the well around. So the pump is going to be able to pump that much. Will we pump it 24/7 at that rate? Probably not. It'll be based on the demand of the system. So, in the summertime, you might see that pumping to fill the tank during the day, during the peak time to fill the tank, but it would probably be a 12 on, 12 off kind of scenario, even during the summer. And then the winter, it'll depend on the demand.
Thank you.
Just curious. Which tank does that pump to? Is it Ash Canyon or any combination of them?
So that pumps into the quill zone.
Okay, gotcha.
We have the possibility to, and we're looking at this since it's such a good well, possibly connecting it to the ash zone in the future, so that in an emergency, we could actually supply it to there as well, even without quill transferring it up to ash. So a little more flexibility, a bigger generator there, maybe one that has more fuel in case of an emergency situation. We're kind of looking at all different types of scenarios.
Another question. Did you have to go deeper with this well too, or is it the same depth as the?
It's about the same depth. Okay. It's about 500 feet.
Okay.
It's just based on that telescoping down, we were limited on where we could set the pump.
Sure.
So now we can go deeper and
Nice.
hence more capacity.
Thanks.
Last capital improvement project ongoing right now is we just kicked off a electrical upgrade at Quill Water Treatment Plant, and that's replacing original motor control panels and VFDs. It's also removing an old generator in the building. I don't know if you toured it, you probably saw that old generator. So we're going to be officially removing that one. So that project got kicked off today, actually. And then I was going to wrap up with some miscellaneous projects that, I started when I started here or throughout the last year that are kind of coming to fruition. I discussed last time about the temporary water right permits that we're working on for being able to use Ash and Kings Creek water at our induction wells down by the river. We just filed the permits last week with the state engineer's office to do that, so we're waiting approval for that. We've installed 3 gauges in the storm drain system to track that water for additional tracking that the state engineer wanted us to do. So, good project that's coming to fruition, and it's producing good results so far in the last few weeks that we've had the gauges in place. Moving on, we're in review stage for our Quill Water Treatment Plant preliminary engineering report that Far West helped us with. That's in its second round of reviews, and we'll hopefully have a final draft soon. So that is going to be most likely discussed during when we go over the water CIP as part of the rates, and we're currently playing with what year we want to do that project and where that fits into the rate structure and everything. So that's a good timing for that report to be done, I feel. Another project is outsourcing our tracking of our privately owned backflow preventers throughout the community. Previously we were tracking all the data, so they're tested every year. We were tracking that. If they weren't getting tested, we would be sending out letters. It was taking up about a half FTE in our meter department. So the idea was, is there a business out there that tracks it for you and sends out those notices to the businesses that own the backflow preventers? without us having to do it, and but maybe the cost being transferred to the testers or to the businesses themselves. So that project is through data transfer. It took quite a ways to get here, but we're possibly starting next month on the testers sending the data to the third-party company, Aqua Backflow, and they would be administering it for us. So get more help back on our side on running the system was the idea. So that's exciting news. Another project that we started about 6 months ago was a meter project. I think I've presented on that here. It's looking at statistics and efficiencies of these older meters we have in town. And first we wanted to look at the commercial meters and see if they're running slower, which meters tend to run slower over time. So we wanted to know, well, how much slower and how much lost revenue are we not gaining from that? Is it worth replacing them all, et cetera? So it's a really in-depth statistical look. We had to get them 5 years of data. It's on approximately 1,200 meters. And then we're doing a full year data push of data to them, to this statistical company to tell us if the meters are inadequate. So that project is in full swing. We're in our full year test right now. We just kicked off on it. So we have all the past data all cleaned up to them, and we're moving forward. And that's all I have for you today. If there's any questions or anything else, I'll take them. Thanks.
Seeing none, thank you, Eddie.
Alrighty, I'll jump in on the wastewater side. From a staffing standpoint, since our last meeting, fully staffed for the first time. So excited about that. We are anticipating one retirement possibly in the spring. We're watching. On the sewer side, got several basically surgeries coming up. Nothing related to their work here, but just people aging and need to fix stuff. So one of those in mid-November and possibly one in January that put people out for in that 6-week to 3-month time frame kind of deal. So, and also one other guy in that department that we may have a potential military deployment coming up in the spring. So looking at the possibility of bringing on a seasonal or even contractor assistance to cover us in that time frame if necessary. The sewer side, started our CCTV project today with Dr. Pipeline. Kind of a new deal. We're utilizing Code Red. Just put a blast out in the area where they're going to be on a week-to-week basis, just so people know that, yeah, that truck is supposed to be there. It's okay. So if the neighbors are talking, that kind of thing. But should be no more impact than if our guys were out there doing it. But on the wastewater side, phase 2 of the work at the treatment plant is wrapping up. It's basically down to just the final control upgrades, integration of that work, and some insulation on the air scrubber piping. So it's largely done. And then on the effluent reuse master plan, just an update there. That work is scoped. Just finished that. We're looking to probably bring that in December to the Board of Supervisors to kick that off. Did present that kind of what we're looking to do with that project at the APWA conference this fall. So put some people to sleep for half an hour or so, but only one, I think. So that's my update, short and sweet.
Any questions for Andy? Seeing none, thank you, Andy. Anything else, Darren?
I just thought of stormwater. You talk about short and sweet, but I just thought of one project that we're currently doing on stormwater, and that is the linear ditch cleanup from Roop to the east. So we're kind of dredging across that ditch, pulling material out, letting it dry, and then hauling it out to our landfill. It's a project that's been on our list for 10 years, and we never could get to it. But it is one of the small projects that was in that last bond that we passed. So we got funding to actually do some maintenance on one of our ditches. So it's a big deal to us because we don't get to do many of these. Anyway, if you if you drive out there and you want to know what's going on, that's what it is. It looks, compared to the way before and after pictures, it really, really tells you, how those ditches can get filled in over time, obviously. So other than that, there's not much going on in stormwater, so that's what we got.
Sounds like you might need some more capital money in stormwater, huh? Well, thank you for the update on that. I guess that closes item 2C, and then we'll move on to item 3, which is information only, future agenda items. Anybody on the committee like to discuss a future agenda item? Bruce?
I'd just like to verify, I had on my schedule, we were going to originally meet a couple weeks from now, and I assumed this meeting took the place of that, but I was going to ask.
Yes, that's correct. That meeting got canceled in place of this one. After you go through there, chairman will talk about the next meeting date, unless somebody else has something else first.
Seeing that there's nothing else, let's go ahead and go through the next meeting dates.
Okay, so after what we heard today on stormwater and then on the water and wastewater rate refresh portion of the study, we'll be ready to bring those preliminary results forward as well. So just with the holidays coming up and getting here, so we just talked, we think we probably should be looking into next year, and I didn't know what January 7th or January 14th might look for folks in terms of our next UFOC meeting to discuss those, at least those 3 items.
January 14th is good for me. 7th, I already have a commitment.
That works for me.
14th works for Bruce. Jeff?
Either one.
As long as the 14th doesn't get into the Nevada basketball game versus Wyoming, I think we're good.
Okay.
How long are you going to talk, Randy?
Don't make it.
Bring a shorter list.
I have a conflict on the 14th.
On the 14th.
We could look at I just stuck with Tuesdays because that's typically what we've been doing, but we could move it to another day of the week. Again, we need to find out if this room is available, but potentially the 13th, which is Monday, or the 15th, which is Wednesday. I think generally 1:30 works pretty good for this committee, so I would.
Yeah, I'm open on either one of those.
And I'm open on the 13th as well.
Is the 15th, does that work for you? Bob?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
Actually, Monday is the clean day that week.
Okay.
I
think that'll work.
That'll work. 13 will work. All right, let's plan for January 13th.
Okay, so we'll just need to confirm that this room is available.
Okay.
So let's leave it as tentative, and then we'll get an email out right away on that. So
Committee here, do we have time? And I guess my question for you is really more for you, Darren, that you mentioned you want to talk about water and sewer at the same time. Do you think it's going to be a long discussion?
Well, I thought about that. The stormwater discussion, a lot, we sifted through actually quite a bit today, and we've got some pretty good marching orders, so I don't anticipate that being, more than an hour at the next meeting. It could be, we'll certainly want to talk it through. And then water and wastewater, we're just looking at the preliminary of what they found preliminary. We're not ready for any recommendations.
Okay.
We just want to roll out the preliminary. This is what we're looking at. This is what Far West has found in terms of trends. And again, just to kind of bounce some ideas and thoughts off of you and where we go from there in terms of narrowing that down moving forward. So I think that discussion is also going to be pretty short.
That sounds good. Okay. So tentatively January 13th. If there's nothing else to talk about on that item, we'll move on to public comment. Seeing no public comment. With that, Council, were you the one who told me I don't need to take an action to adjourn?
Technically, you don't. You can just say adjourn.
With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.